Thank you, everyone, for joining us at the Project Censored radio show. We're very glad right now to be joined by Phil Wilayto, who's a longtime social justice activist based in Richmond, Virginia. He is the co-founder of the Virginia Defenders for Freedom, Justice, and Equality, and the Virginia Prison Justice Network. He's the editor of the Virginia Defender newspaper, coordinator of the Odessa Solidarity Campaign, and the author of several books, including In Defense of Iran, Notes from a U.S. Peace Delegation's Journey Through the Islamic Republic. Phil, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
So let's start by discussing what transpired at these NATO meetings, which were recently held in Bucharest on November 29th and 30th. And they were open to not just the 30 member states, but also to Sweden and Finland, who are officially not yet members. But as Jens Stoltenberg basically talked about them as if their membership was a foregone conclusion, it was also open to non-NATO foreign ministers, including Ukraine, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Georgia, and Moldova. So, Phil, I want to start basically with what happened at this meeting and this continued push east, and how this is really, pushing us closer to not just a world war, but a nuclear world war.
Well, the purpose of the meeting was to strengthen and expand NATO, both in terms of its numbers of members, but also its scope. The issue of China came up as a major topic, and China, of course, is not in the North Atlantic, but NATO has really evolved into a U.S.-led military alliance that sees the whole world as its arena. And the presence of Georgia and Moldova in particular, Moldova borders Ukraine and Georgia borders Russia itself, would be seen as particularly threatening to Russia. And of course, with Sweden and Finland also has a long land border with Russia. So this continuing expansion that's gone on since the collapse of the Soviet Union since 1991 has been all eastward in the direction of Russia, and has been a major factor in leading Russia to come to the conclusion that it was facing an existential threat. And that feeling will only be exacerbated by this meeting. The topic of Ukraine was, of course, front and center, and there were more commitments to provide military assistance, as well as what they call non-lethal assistance. But of course, it's all to support the war effort. One frustrating thing for Ukraine is that although Ukraine was told back in 2008 that it would be allowed to join NATO, and a meeting actually held in the same palace building in Bucharest, Romania, where the NATO meeting of foreign ministers was just held, Ukraine is still not allowed to join NATO. And that's for several reasons. For a long time, it was simply because Ukraine didn't meet certain standards, particularly around the question of corruption. Ukraine has always been known as one of the most corrupt countries in the world. In 2015, the Guardian newspaper named it the most corrupt country in Europe, and the latest poll that I was able to see placed it around 122 out of 180 nations, and number one was the least corrupt. So that was a pretty damning assessment. But at this point, probably the main reason that Ukraine is not allowed to join is that Ukraine could then invoke Article 5 of the NATO agreement, which states that an attack on any of the 30 present members of NATO would be considered as an attack on all members, and they would all have to respond. So that's probably what's holding NATO back at this particular time. But it definitely, when you see the non-NATO members that were invited and were able to participate in certain parts of the conference, and then the declaration that the ministers made collectively, and then the statements that NATO has posted on its website concerning its pivot, as you were, to China, and seeing that as a threat also. You can see that this really was, meant to strengthen and expand NATO as a global military force.
Yeah, absolutely, Phil. And I'm glad that you brought up China, because that was something that I wanted to get into as well. And just to highlight what you talked about with regards to Ukraine and Article 5, U.S. senators ahead of the talks also issued a letter calling for the U.S. to provide lethal armed attack drones to Ukraine. And Russia actually canceled nuclear talks with the U.S. at the last minute because, as the deputy foreign minister, Ryabakov said, quote, "We are sending signals to the Americans that their line of escalation and ever deeper involvement in this conflict is fraught with dire consequences. The risks are growing," end quote. And I think that message should send chills through the spines of every human being on this planet, because of the threat of nuclear war that is growing because of the U.S. quest for hegemony. And I want to, with that in mind, this shift to China, which, as you pointed out, and even survivors of U.S. geography class will attest to, is not anywhere near the North Atlantic. I just have to wonder, why are all these member states going along with this idea? The U.S. is saying China may invade, which is absurd. Why are member states going along with this when it's so clear that this makes the entire world so much less secure and stable and threatens the annihilation of our entire species?
Well, let's see, we could give a mainstream pundit response to that, or we could give a little more in-depth analysis. Let's go halfway at first, and then we work backwards. A good example of how major capitalist powers work, is what happened in the Middle East after World War I. Middle East was essentially, part of the Ottoman Empire. There were very few actual countries. England and France were worried that that Russia, which had just gone through its revolution, might have designs on moving into the Middle East, and so France and England divided up the Middle East, created countries like Saudi Arabia and Iraq and Jordan, and went so far and picked their leadership, and in Saudi Arabia's situation, designed their flag, manufactured it in London, and sent it to them to fly. Created these countries which they controlled through their bought and paid for leadership, leaving out certain ethnic groups such as the Palestinians and the Kurds, which has led to the present ongoing conflicts in the Middle East. Well, when Jefferson Davis, it was Jefferson Davis, I'm sorry, I got my right-wing presidents mixed up. When Thomas Jefferson was president, and he saw French designs coming up into the western part of North America, from Mexico, and the English ensconced in Canada and looking southward, he decided he better get out there and plant the flag in these Western territories, not because he had any particular immediate plans for them, but because he didn't want the others to come in. So he sent out the Lewis and Clark expedition. So it's been a pattern where major powers feel that they are only secure if they control large sections of the world. And in this period, when capitalism is very unstable, and going through a series of recessions and supply side problems and conflicts and competition, the United States, the most powerful capitalist country, feels that the only way that it can secure its position in the world as a leading economic power is to be the leading military power and control the rest of the world, in whether it's by alliances or directly. And so Russia is that's a David and Goliath battle between the U.S. and Russia. Russia's total military budget is about 11% of that of the United States, and 8% of that of all the NATO countries combined. China is described as the second most powerful military in the world, but that leaves out the fact that the U.S. military is more money is spent on the U.S. military than the next 7 or 8 countries combined, including China. So it's an economic competition. China is not attacking anyone. China is not at war with anyone. The U.S. has been at war for its entire existence as a country, and before that, with the indigenous population, but also with foreign wars, and with foreign wars uninterrupted since World War II. China has one foreign military base. The United States has 800 in 70 countries. An aircraft carrier is a floating military base that can project air power anywhere that it goes. China has 2 aircraft carriers. Russia, I believe, has 2, and the United States has at least a dozen. 1 or 2 of the countries are building one, so the number's changing. But it shows, when you're talking about a balance of forces and which militaries are set up for aggression as opposed to defense, the United States is clearly the one that's the aggressor. We're not a country anymore. We're an empire. And they're not going to allow for any viable competition from friend or foe. And they've stated that in internal documents that have been leaked over the years. So they worry about an alliance between Russia and China, and the Ukraine war has given it an opportunity to deplete the resources, the military and economic resources of Russia, and with the tremendous number of sanctions imposed on Russia, they're hoping that this will create discontent within the country and lead to some sort of a quote unquote color revolution. And they like to split, they like to scare China enough to force China to back off from its alliance with Russia. And then it'll deal with Russia, with China directly, maybe in the form of a war over Taiwan, which the U.S. could stand back and just provide military weapons and support, like it's doing in Ukraine, and using the people of Taiwan as cannon fodder, which is what they're doing in Ukraine. So it's all extremely dangerous. One thing I would want to point out is that this whole question of Russia threatening to use nuclear weapons, what President Putin said was that, we're facing nuclear powers, and they should remember that we have nuclear weapons also. And from that, the U.S. extrapolated, saying that Russia was planning on using nuclear weapons. At this point, Russia would like to remind the NATO and the U.S. that it does have nuclear weapons. And I think if it didn't, we probably would be seeing a land war in Russia at this time. The U.S. has no compunction about getting involved in wars it thinks it can win, but it's not going to take on a nuclear power. So this war, works well in its favor in terms of depleting Russia's resources, attempting to isolate it internationally, testing out new weapons, making a hell of a lot of money for U.S. arms manufacturers, and now with the sanctions against Russian gas, a great deal of money for U.S. gas companies that are selling gas to Europe in markets that they didn't have before because of Russian competition.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you pointed out, with a great contextualizing of history as well, NATO is really just U.S. empire. It's another name for U.S. empire and imperialism. But I'm curious, so there are 30 member states officially of NATO. Why do you think that the other member states are allowing the U.S. to push this far?
Well, there have been some disagreements within the NATO alliance, but the United States is the big guy on the block. That's the one that you don't want to be alienated from, because where do you go? it's the only game in town unless you're going to ally with Russia and China, and that can get you in trouble economically. So yeah, essentially, it's you know they've dug themselves into a position. You see the problems that Germany is getting into. It wants to maintain trade relations with China, um, and it had been so-called dependent on Russian gas. I mean, I'm dependent on my local gas station for gas, but I don't usually call it that. I usually say, I buy gas from my local gas station, and I give them money. They give me gas. It's a mutual agreement. But Germany is dependent on Russian gas, and now that that's no longer available, they see that it's a problem, winding up in a situation where you're dependent on the U.S. So they want to maintain their trade relations with China. The U.S. isn't happy about that. They're trying to pressure them to back off from that. Germany's kind of caught between a rock and a hard place. But overall, the U.S. is still the dominant economic and military power in the world. And if you don't ally with them, then it's you're my friend or you're my enemy, and they have to make a choice.
Yeah, well put. It is very binary in that sense. And I kind of want to shift right now to cover something that the Project Censored show covers a lot, which is media access, media literacy, media freedom. Because in your newsletter, where you shared information about the NATO meetings, you also highlighted the total lack of transparency with regards to media accreditation. And you linked to the NATO site, which shares information about that accreditation very overtly. It says, quote, "Journalists need special accreditation to cover the event in person. In accordance with NATO media accreditation procedures, NATO reserves the right to deny or withdraw accreditation of media representatives who abuse their privileges, put the accreditation to improper use, or act in a way not consistent with the principles of the organization," end quote, which just reminds me of one of those laws that's so vague that they're just, it only exists so that they can use it to throw the book at you because there are loopholes wide enough to fit an army through. And I'm just curious, so what does this mean in terms of alternative media's access to what happened at these meetings? And what information do you think we might be losing out on or not getting because of this total lack of transparency?
Well, yeah, that was really an amazing statement on the NATO website. You can come. Even if you are accredited to attend NATO events, you need a special accreditation for this meeting, which was of all the foreign ministers of NATO member countries. And then they made it very clear that if you say anything we don't like, we're going to toss you out. Now, meanwhile, outside, there was a woman who from Canada who is with Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and I'm really sorry that I don't remember her name offhand. I wasn't familiar with it before, but she went to Bucharest with a sign that said "No to NATO, Peace in Ukraine," and tried to stand outside the palace where they were holding the meeting, and the police drove her off. Now, wow. So not even, and usually when these meetings take place, the European peace movement at least tries to mobilize something around it, but they didn't even try this time. But this one brave woman went out and tried to hold a sign, and they wouldn't let her do that. Because of the restrictions of the news media, we can't really think that any mainstream news coverage of the meeting is going to be objective. So they obviously, wanted to talk about things that they didn't want the general public to know, even though all of these, these countries, supply their militaries with goods and services paid for by the public's tax money, but the public has no right to know what's going on with that. So it's we don't really know what was discussed, in private, and what deals might have been made and what promises might have been made, but we do know that there's a new global point of view of NATO, and they really see themselves as paying attention to what goes on anywhere in the world. We know that they've been trying to recruit Colombia into NATO. Colombia is in South America, not the North Atlantic. And it's only going to increase tensions when you think of Russia looking out and saying, good Lord, they want every single country that borders us to be a member of their military alliance. And those countries like Georgia and Finland and Sweden and Ukraine have already been, cooperating militarily with NATO. So it would be as if, some hostile power had recruited every country in Latin America and the Caribbean except Mexico, and including Canada, into a hostile military alliance against the United States, and was conducting joint military exercises with Mexico up to the Rio Grande and in the Gulf of Mexico. And then if the US said, hey, don't forget we have nuclear weapons, they would say, oh my God, you see, these people are barbaric. They're just incredible. No wonder we have to have a military alliance. So I'd also want to point out that, the latest figures that I've been able to find from mainstream sources, in trying to make these arguments to the U.S. public, it doesn't do you much good to just use leftist sources or independent sources. So, and the mainstream ones occasionally will slip something out. But at this point, it looks like the U.S. has given $60 billion to Ukraine in 2022, and they're a coalition group of 50 other countries that they pulled together to send money to Ukraine has given another more than 40 billion. So we're talking about more than $100 billion in 2022, when the entire defense budget for Russia in 2021, according to the Stockholm Institute for Peace, I forget the whole formal name, but it's a real it's the one all the mainstream media quotes. Russia was 66 billion, as opposed to 100 billion just this year for the war effort. So it's a very unequal battle, and it's very dangerous. I don't think Russia has given any indication by its past actions that it would think about using nuclear weapons, unless it was facing an actual existential threat, either an invasion of their country or the use of nuclear weapons against its forces. So I don't worry so much about that. What I worry about is the United States winning on every front and becoming the undisputed master of the world, and all of us will be in pretty bad situation if that happens.
Absolutely. I mean, the situation, as you pointed out, is very precarious as it stands right now. And you mentioned the money flowing, and all 30 current members of NATO have agreed to spend at least 2% of their respective GDPs on national security by 2025. And we're looking at this at a time when people in Europe are struggling to pay for just to heat their homes. And it's supposed to be a very cold winter. It already is. People in the US are struggling in this recession, so-called. And yet, as you pointed out, billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars for the Ukrainians, but nothing for the people of these member states who are freezing to death, hungry, and need support. And so kind of with that, I wanted to talk about your efforts in building solidarity and support for folks. You have started something called the Odessa Solidarity Campaign, which says supporting the heroic anti-fascist people of Ukraine. And for folks who aren't aware, of course, Ukraine is headed by a fascist government that was installed by the United States in 2014. And so, Phil, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the Odessa Solidarity Campaign and the importance of building these kind of solidarity networks across borders.
Well, it's kind of an interesting story. The Odessa Solidarity Campaign is a project of the Virginia Defenders for Freedom, Justice, and Equality, which is a small organization here in Virginia, United States, and was founded in 2002, predominantly African-American, predominantly women organization. It's all volunteer, and we began as a group of people who had relatives uh, in the state's prisons or jails, and were concerned about the conditions there. And that's an issue we've always worked on, and we're actually pulling together the sixth annual Virginia Prison Justice Rally that will take place in the capital city of Richmond on January 14th. It's the largest support rally for prisoners in the state every year. Several hundred people turn out. Um, and we've always been involved in the anti-war movement, and always felt that, the slogan "Stop the Wars at Home and Abroad" was a good perspective to have. You can't just work, especially when you live in the center of the empire. You can't just be concerned about improving conditions for working class people and communities of color here. You have to be always aware of what the government is doing in your name around the world. So we've always been involved in the anti-war movement, and we were asked in 2016 to attend a conference in Poland, a social forum, similar to the World Social Forum that takes place every year. It was organized by some Polish activists, and my father's family is Polish, and I kind of jumped at the opportunity to go. And my wife and I went, Anna Edwards, who is a public historian and plays a major role in Richmond in reclaiming sites important to the Black community's history, since Richmond was the center of the U.S. domestic slave trade. So we went to Poland, and there we met people from Odessa who were trying to get attention on the fact that there had been a terrible massacre of progressive people in Odessa on May 2nd, 2014. This was a few months after the right-wing coup that overthrew the duly elected president and brought in a right-wing government with the active support of neo-Nazi organizations, paramilitary organizations. And what happened was there were conflicting marches and protests in Odessa for and against the coup. And it came to a head when there was a very large soccer match going on. I mean, a very well attended soccer match going on in town, and soccer matches tend to draw a lot of right wing activists who like to see them as an opportunity to get out in the street and mix it up with opponents. And they were whipped up into a nationalist fervor by neo-Nazi organizations and attacked a little encampment of people who were collecting signatures to demand the right to elect their own governor in the oblast or province of Odessa. In the United States, we elect our governors. In Odessa, they're appointed by the central government, which now was right wing and hostile to the Russian minority, of which there's a substantial number of folks in Odessa. Maybe 30% of the city, but some 90% speak Russian as their primary language, and always had close, ties to Russia. It was established by Russia back in the 1700s. Anyway, so this large mob led by the neo-Nazi groups attacked this much smaller group and chased them into a 5-story building called the House of Trade Unions, and set it on fire. And at least 42 people died from the flames, smoke inhalation, jumping from buildings and then being from the building and then being beaten as they hit the ground. The police stood by and did nothing. The right wingers kept the fire department from approaching the area until there had been this real massacre. And so this group called the Council of Mothers of May 2, relatives of those who were killed, were trying to get international attention to get a real investigation of what happened, because that had never been allowed by the Ukrainian government. So we decided to meet with them, my wife and I, and we felt like they had the most, compelling story of anyone we had met at the conference. And we asked, what we could do to help. And we expected that they would, they showed us videos of the massacre, and many people took cell phone videos and posted them online. So there's lots and lots and lots of video coverage. There's very, very you can't watch it without wanting to do something about it. So we thought they would, say, well, can you write an article? Can you help us with our petition campaign? Can you demand an international investigation? And instead, they said, well, on May 2nd of 2016, we're going to have our second annual memorial for those who were killed. We go out every week or every month, but this is a big thing. And the neo-Nazi organizations have announced that they're going to come and attack us and create another May 2nd. So would you come to Odessa as an international observer? Because maybe if people from other countries, particularly the United States, would come, that the government would hold back the fascists. So I swallowed real hard. And of course, this was, what are you going to do? We already said we would, do whatever we could. So I felt like we were stuck. And besides, these people were so absolutely inspiring and so courageous. And we said yes. So I tried to recruit, a whole delegation from the U.S. to come. We wound up with 3 people. Bruce Gagnon, who heads up the global network against weapons and nuclear power in space, and Regis Tremblay, who's a friend of Bruce's and an independent videographer. So the 3 of us went over, and it was to say the least, an incredibly interesting time. And we took the precaution of putting together an international campaign calling on the Ukrainian government to hold back the fascists, and the U.S. government to urge the Ukrainian government to hold back the fascists. Held a press conference outside the Ukrainian embassy in New York, in Washington, D.C., gave a letter to the effect of what we were asking for to a representative of the embassy. And a reporter from the TASS news agency from Russia covered the press conference, and the next day was at a State Department briefing and asked the State Department representative if he knew there were going to be Americans, so-called, at the Odessa Memorial, and he said no, but now he knew. So if if people from the U.S., I don't like to use the word American because the whole hemisphere is American. I usually say U.S. North Americans, but nobody else says that. So, if people from the United States had been killed, or even injured or even arrested, they probably would have gotten news coverage. Where that's not what the U.S. wanted. They didn't want to remind people that there had been a massacre in Odessa and that there was international support. So we hope that had some effect in holding back any attack. But the real reason that there were no problems that day, or almost no problems, was that 3,000 to 4,000 people turned out for the memorial, and the Azov Battalion was there. That's one of the neo-Nazi groups. It's now being praised as the great defenders of Ukraine. And as we had lunch with the Council of Mothers of May 2, and then got on a bus and went to the memorial site, which is the site of the massacre, Kulikovo Square, where the House of Trade Unions is. And on the way, we had to stop at a stoplight at an intersection. And on the right were about 20 people, young people standing there. And they were the Azov Battalion. And when they looked at the bus, apparently they realized who this was, maybe because we were headed towards the square. And they jumped up and they started throwing the Nazi salute, and somebody threw a rock at the bus and they were jeering and screaming. And then later they showed up at the memorial, and they had a small march through the crowd to try to intimidate people, which didn't work. But they were also all around the city, and they had set up roadblocks to the city to try to stop any international observers from coming into town. And fortunately, we didn't run into them. But this is the organization that now is a representative just spoke before the U.S. Congress and has been touring elementary schools in the U.S. to talk about Ukraine. These people, they're fascists. I mean, they trace themselves back to the the Ukrainian fascist forces in World War II that allied with the Nazis and the Nazi occupation. They even have the double lightning symbol that was adopted from the SS. They revere Stefan Bandera, the Ukrainian fascist leader, whose birthday is now a national holiday in Ukraine, and 6 statues have been built for him since the 2014 coup, and they have a postage stamp in his honor. I would not characterize the Ukrainian government as fascist. I would characterize it as ultranationalist, right wing, which works closely with mass neo-Nazi organizations that are funded by individual oligarchs, which, by the way, is where I think we're headed in this country, a very real possibility, with a right-wing Republican government in open cooperation with groups like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers. So I kind of forgot where we started off this, but where the Odessa Solidarity Campaign went to. So after we got back to the U.S., we decided to form a permanent organization to keep alive the memory of the Odessa massacre and help and through that those continued memorials, which we have encouraged across North America and Europe at least every year since. The reality of what that coup in 2014 meant, the fact that fascist organizations now openly roam the streets of Ukraine, that you're not allowed to go out and have any kind of a progressive dissent or protest, and that they're viciously anti-Russian minority. Some of them attack the camps of the Roma people. It's like it's like the SS having free reign in the country. So this year we initiated a statement on the war in Ukraine. We have not endorsed the Russian intervention. We have not condemned the Russian intervention. What we've been trying to point out is that the U.S. support, at least, for the 2014 coup and the continued expansion of NATO since 1991 to the very borders of Russia is what has provoked this war and put Russia into a situation where it felt it was under an existential threat. And we point out that President Putin had been calling for negotiations over its security concerns since December of last year into January, and continues to do that. And it's Ukraine that refuses to negotiate. We try to explain that after the coup, the predominantly Russian ethnic area of Crimea, which had been part of Russia since 1954, and it was administratively transferred to Ukraine by the Russian Federation, voted in a mass referendum to rejoin Russia, which Russia allowed. It was not an invasion of Crimea. It was not a forcible annexation. That the people of Donbass and Luhansk, who are heavily Russian minority, who had been under attack by the Ukrainian military since 2014, and those attacks were increasing, had declared their independence, and that independence was recognized by Russia, and Russia intervened in February 24th of this year to protect the people of Donbass, to demilitarize the Ukrainian state, and to denazify the Ukrainian state. Those were the 3 stated objectives. It is hard to see what Russia could have done faced with a situation in which they were being surrounded by hostile countries, conducting military exercises right up to their border, recruiting new neighbors into Ukraine, and conducting this mass war on the people of the Donbass who had declared their independence and were looking to Russia for support. They could have just stood by and let another massacre take place, and they chose not to do that. I think that for people who consider themselves advocates of peace and want to see this war come to an end, instead of making demands on Russia, I think what they need to do is demand that the U.S. and NATO get out of this conflict, remove their military forces from countries bordering Russia, stop sending military support to Ukraine. We would like to see the abolishment of NATO, which was originally set up to counter Soviet influence in Europe, but has now become a global army for the US, which is not acceptable to us and to many people around the world. Um, and money for jobs and education, not for wars and occupation. Let's stop believing this, torrent of right-wing propaganda that all the mainstream media is following in terms of what's really at stake in Ukraine, and withdraw U.S. and NATO support and let the Ukrainian and Russian people settle it themselves.
Yes, absolutely. And that, I mean, there was a lot there, but yeah, I think, Russia and Ukraine actually tried to sit down and have peace talks, but the US and UK and NATO in general stopped that from happening. And it's become quite the US hegemony battle. And I think it's important to point out that war is hell regardless. So absolutely, there are people in Ukraine who are suffering because of this. And that should not be downplayed. The fact that it's happening because of US imperialism should not be downplayed either. Two of those things can exist simultaneously. And I think that as Americans or as US citizens or residents, we have an obligation not for the Russian government, but for our own government, and to dictate and demand what our government does,
Right.
not what any other government of the world does. So, Phil, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. Folks can check out the Solidarity Campaign over at odessasolidarity.campaign.org. And thank you again, Phil. Really appreciate you taking the time, and thank you for all of your work on this topic.
Thanks so much for having me on. You're the only media that's responded to our statement, by the way, which has been signed by more than 200 organizations and individuals around the country from 22 countries. But I guess that's not news. But thank you so much, though. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Phil.